Few people remember the biblical account of Joseph's death in Egypt, yet his story is one of the most fascinating and mysterious in all of Scripture. Joseph, the dreamer, the interpreter of visions, the man who rose from slavery to become the second most powerful figure in Egypt, met an end that was as extraordinary as his life. But here's the twist. Joseph's body wasn't buried immediately after his death. Instead, it was preserved, mummified, and placed in an Egyptian sarcophagus, where it remained for centuries. Why? What was so significant about Joseph's final wish that his family would go to such lengths to keep his body preserved for so long? And what does this strange detail reveal about the deeper story of God's promises? Joseph's life was marked by dramatic twists, betrayal, slavery, imprisonment, and an astonishing rise to power. But his death holds secrets that are just as compelling. Why did Joseph, a Hebrew, receive the honor of an Egyptian mummification? What was the significance of his body remaining unburied for generations? And why was it so crucial that his bones be carried out of Egypt centuries later? These questions aren't just historical curiosities. They point to a profound mystery that connects Joseph's story to the larger narrative of God's plan for his people. As we dive into this story, you'll discover that Joseph's death wasn't just the end of a remarkable life. It was a pivotal moment that set the stage for one of the most dramatic events in biblical history. But to understand the full significance of Joseph's final days, we'll need to unravel the layers of his life, his faith, and the promises he held on to until his very last breath. What was it about Joseph's death that made it so different from others? And what does it reveal about the unshakable hope he carried even in a foreign land? Stay with me, because this is just the beginning. By the end of this series, you'll see how Joseph's story and his mysterious death foreshadowed something far greater than anyone could have imagined. But for now, let's start with the question that hangs in the air. Why was Joseph's body kept in Egypt for so long? And what did it mean for the future of an entire nation? The answers might just change the way you see the Bible's most unexpected hero. Joseph's story is one of the most captivating in the entire Bible, and his life serves as a cornerstone in the unfolding drama of God's plan for his people. As one of the 12 sons of Jacob, Joseph was destined for greatness, but his journey was anything but easy. From the very beginning, Joseph stood out, not just because of the colorful robe his father gave him, but because of the dreams he had. Dreams that hinted at a future where his family would bow before him. These dreams, however, didn't sit well with his brothers. Fueled by jealousy and resentment, they plotted against him, selling him to a caravan of Ishmaelite traders who took him to Egypt. But this wasn't the end of Joseph's story. It was only the beginning. In Egypt, Joseph's life took a series of dramatic turns. He went from being a slave in Potiphar's house to being falsely accused and thrown into prison. Yet, through it all, Joseph remained faithful to God. His integrity and wisdom eventually led him to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, warning of 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. This divine insight not only saved Egypt from disaster, but also propelled Joseph to the position of second in command over the entire kingdom. Joseph's rise to power wasn't just about personal success, it was about God's greater purpose. When famine struck the region, Joseph's family back in Canaan was forced to seek food in Egypt. This set the stage for an emotional reunion between Joseph and his brothers, who had once betrayed him. Instead of seeking revenge, Joseph forgave them, recognizing that God had used their evil intentions for good. He declared, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." This moment of reconciliation wasn't just a personal victory for Joseph, it was a turning point for the entire family of Israel. Under Joseph's provision, Jacob and his descendants settled in Egypt, where they thrived and multiplied. But even as Joseph enjoyed his position of power and influence, he never forgot his roots or the promises God had made to his ancestors. His life was a testament to God's faithfulness, even in the midst of trials and suffering. Yet, as we'll see, Joseph's story doesn't end with his rise to power or even his reconciliation with his brothers. There's something deeper at play, a thread that connects Joseph's life to the future of an entire nation. What was it about Joseph's role in Egypt that made his death so significant? And how did his final actions set the stage for one of the most pivotal moments in biblical history? The answers lie in the mystery of his death and the extraordinary request he made about his remains. Stay with me, because the story is about to take an even more surprising turn. Joseph's arrival in Egypt marked the beginning of a journey that would test his faith, resilience, and character in ways he could never have imagined. Stripped of his freedom and separated from his family, Joseph found himself in a foreign land, surrounded by a culture and religion vastly different from his own. Yet, even in the midst of his suffering, God was with him. Joseph's first stop in Egypt was the house of Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. Despite being a slave, Joseph excelled in his work, earning Potiphar's trust and rising to a position of responsibility within the household. But Joseph's integrity would soon be tested. Potiphar's wife, captivated by Joseph's character and appearance, attempted to seduce him. When Joseph refused, she falsely accused him of misconduct, leading to his imprisonment. It's hard to imagine the depth of Joseph's despair in that moment. Betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, and now imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. Yet, even in the darkness of a prison cell, Joseph's faith remained unshaken. In prison, Joseph's gift for interpreting dreams once again came to the forefront. When Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker were imprisoned, Joseph accurately interpreted their dreams, predicting the cupbearer's restoration and the baker's execution. Though Joseph asked the cupbearer to remember him, he was forgotten for a time. But God's timing is perfect. 2 years later, Pharaoh himself was troubled by dreams that none of his wise men could interpret. It was then that the cupbearer remembered Joseph and his gift. Summoned from prison, Joseph stood before Pharaoh and interpreted his dreams, revealing that 7 years of abundance would be followed by 7 years of severe famine. Joseph didn't stop there. He offered a plan to store grain during the years of plenty to prepare for the years of scarcity. Impressed by Joseph's wisdom and discernment, Pharaoh elevated him to the position of second in command over all of Egypt. At just 30 years old, Joseph went from prisoner to prince, overseeing the entire nation's food supply. Joseph's rise to power wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a divine appointment. Through his leadership, Egypt not only survived the famine, but became a refuge for surrounding nations, including Joseph's own family. When his brothers came to Egypt seeking food, they unknowingly stood before the brother they had betrayed. What followed was a dramatic and emotional reunion, as Joseph revealed his identity and extended forgiveness to his brothers. But Joseph's story in Egypt isn't just about his rise to power or his reconciliation with his family. It's about how God used one man's faithfulness to preserve an entire nation. Joseph's life in Egypt was a testament to God's sovereignty, showing that even in the darkest moments, he is working behind the scenes to fulfill his promises. Yet, as we'll see, Joseph's time in Egypt was only part of the story. His death and the mystery surrounding his remains would carry a significance that echoed far beyond his lifetime. What was it about Joseph's final days that made them so pivotal? And how did his actions in death shape the future of God's people? The answers lie ahead, and they're more profound than you might expect. The famine that brought Joseph's brothers to Egypt was more than just a crisis, it was a divine setup. Unbeknownst to them, the brother they had betrayed now held the power to save or destroy them. When they arrived in Egypt, Joseph recognized them immediately, but they didn't recognize him. Overcome with emotion, Joseph tested his brothers to see if their hearts had changed since the day they sold him into slavery. He accused them of being spies, demanded they bring their youngest brother, Benjamin, and even imprisoned Simeon as collateral. The brothers, unaware of Joseph's true identity, were filled with guilt and fear. They interpreted their troubles as divine retribution for what they had done to Joseph years earlier. When they returned to Egypt with Benjamin, Joseph's emotions reached a breaking point. After a series of tense encounters, Joseph finally revealed himself to his brothers, declaring, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" The room fell silent as his brothers stood in shock, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. Joseph's revelation was followed by an outpouring of grace and forgiveness. He assured his brothers that they were not to blame for his suffering, saying, "Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." Joseph understood that his journey to Egypt was part of a greater plan, a plan to save his family and countless others from starvation. With Pharaoh's blessing, Joseph invited his entire family to settle in Egypt, providing them with the best land in the region of Goshen. Jacob, now an old man, was reunited with the son he thought he had lost. The family of Israel, once fractured by jealousy and betrayal, was restored and given a new beginning in a foreign land. For a time they thrived under Joseph's protection, growing in number and prosperity. But this reunion wasn't just a happy ending. It was the beginning of a new chapter in God's plan. Joseph's rise to power and his family's migration to Egypt set the stage for the fulfillment of a prophecy given to Abraham centuries earlier. God had told Abraham that his descendants would be strangers in a land not their own, where they would be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. Yet he also promised to deliver them and bring them back to the land he had promised. Joseph's story then is not just about his personal journey, it's about the unfolding of God's redemptive plan for his people. But as we'll see, Joseph's role in this plan didn't end with his family's settlement in Egypt. His final actions, particularly his instructions about his remains, carried a significance that would resonate for generations. What was it about Joseph's death that made it so pivotal? And how did his faith in God's promises shape the future of an entire nation? The answers lie in the mystery of his final days, a mystery that points to something far greater than anyone could have imagined. As the years passed, Jacob's time in Egypt drew to a close. The patriarch, now old and frail, called his sons to his bedside to bless them and prophesy over their futures. But before his death, Jacob made a solemn request to Joseph: "Do not bury me in Egypt. When I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried." This request was more than a personal wish. It was a declaration of faith. Jacob wanted to be buried in the land of Canaan, the land God had promised to his ancestors. Joseph, honoring his father's request, personally oversaw the embalming of Jacob's body, a process that took 40 days according to Egyptian customs. Pharaoh granted Joseph permission to leave Egypt, and a grand procession accompanied Joseph and his brothers as they carried Jacob's body to the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Rebekah were buried. This act of burial in Canaan was a powerful statement of hope, a reminder that Egypt was not their home. The promises of God were tied to the land of Canaan, and Jacob's burial there symbolized his unwavering faith in those promises. After Jacob's death, Joseph's brothers feared that he might seek revenge for the wrongs they had done to him. But Joseph reassured them, saying, "Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph's forgiveness was not just an act of personal grace, it was a reflection of his deep trust in God's sovereignty. He understood that every twist and turn in his life had been part of a greater plan. Yet even as Joseph comforted his brothers, he knew that his own time was drawing near. Like his father, Joseph's final days would carry a profound significance. But unlike Jacob, Joseph's body would not be taken to Canaan immediately. Instead, it would remain in Egypt for centuries, a silent witness to the promises of God. Why did Joseph choose this unusual arrangement? And what did it mean for the future of his people? The answers lie in the mystery of Joseph's death, a mystery that would shape the destiny of an entire nation. Joseph's life had been marked by extraordinary events: betrayal, slavery, imprisonment, and an astonishing rise to power. But his death would be no less remarkable. As we'll see, Joseph's final instructions about his remains were not just a personal request. They were a prophetic act, pointing to a future deliverance that would change the course of history. What was it about Joseph's death that made it so significant? And how did his faith in God's promises echo through the generations? The story is about to take a dramatic turn, and the answers will reveal the depth of Joseph's legacy. As Joseph approached the end of his life, His thoughts turned not to the wealth and power he had accumulated in Egypt, but to the promises of God. At 110 years old, an age considered ideal and blessed in Egyptian culture, Joseph gathered his family to deliver his final words. These were not the words of a man reflecting on his personal achievements, but of a man anchored in faith, looking toward a future he would not live to see. Joseph's final message was both a reassurance and a prophecy. He told his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." This declaration was a powerful reminder that Egypt was not their home. Despite the prosperity and security they had found there, Joseph knew that God's promises were tied to the land of Canaan. His words echoed the covenant God had made with Abraham centuries earlier, a promise that Joseph's descendants would one day inherit the land. But Joseph didn't stop there. He made a startling request. "Swear to me that you will carry my bones up from this place." This was no ordinary burial request. Joseph's insistence that his bones be taken out of Egypt was a profound act of faith. It was a declaration that he believed without a doubt that God would fulfill his promises. Even in death, Joseph wanted to be connected to the future deliverance of his people. His bones would serve as a tangible reminder of God's faithfulness, a symbol of hope for generations to come. Joseph's final days were marked by peace and reconciliation. He reassured his brothers once more, reminding them that the evil they had intended against him had been turned into good by the hand of God. His life was a testament to the sovereignty of God, a living example of how even the darkest circumstances can be used to accomplish his purposes. Yet Joseph's death was not the end of the story. His body, embalmed and placed in an Egyptian sarcophagus, would remain in Egypt for centuries. But this was not a permanent resting place. Joseph's bones were a silent witness, waiting for the day when God would fulfill his promise and bring his people out of Egypt. What was it about Joseph's final request that made it so significant? And how did his faith in God's promises shape the future of an entire nation? The answers lie in the events that unfolded long after Joseph's death, events that would reveal the depth of his prophetic vision. Joseph's life had been extraordinary, but his death carried a significance that echoed through the ages. His final words and actions were not just about his own legacy, they were about the faithfulness of God and the certainty of his promises. As we'll see, Joseph's story didn't end with his death. It was only the beginning of a greater story, one that would unfold in ways no one could have imagined. What happened to Joseph's bones? And how did his faith in God's promises shape the destiny of his people? The answers are coming, and they will leave you in awe of God's perfect plan. Joseph's death marked the end of an era, but it also planted the seeds of a future deliverance that would redefine the destiny of his people. At 110 years old, Joseph passed away in Egypt, surrounded by his family and the wealth of a nation he had helped save. Yet his final moments were not focused on the glories of Egypt or the power he had wielded. Instead, they were centered on the promises of God, promises that stretched far beyond his lifetime. Before he died, Joseph made one last request. "God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place." This request was more than a wish for a proper burial. It was a prophetic act. Joseph's bones were to remain in Egypt as a silent witness, a reminder that the Israelites' time in Egypt was temporary. They were not to become comfortable in a land that was not their home. Joseph's faith in God's promises was so strong that he wanted his remains to be part of the future Exodus, the moment when God would lead his people out of Egypt and into the land he had promised. Joseph's death was not the end of his story, it was a bridge to the future. His body, embalmed and placed in an Egyptian sarcophagus, became a symbol of hope. For centuries, his bones lay in Egypt, waiting for the day when God would fulfill his promise. This was no small act of faith. Joseph's request required his descendants to believe in a future they could not yet see, to hold on to a promise that would take generations to fulfill. But why was this so important? Joseph's life had been a testament to God's faithfulness. From the pit to the palace, from betrayal to reconciliation, Joseph had seen firsthand how God could turn even the darkest situations into something good. His final request was a declaration that he believed God would do it again, that he would deliver his people and bring them to the land he had promised. Joseph's death also marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Israelites. After his passing, the Bible tells us that the Israelites continued to live in Egypt, growing in number and prosperity. But over time, the political landscape changed. A new pharaoh rose to power, one who did not know Joseph or the contributions he had made to Egypt. This shift set the stage for a period of oppression and suffering, as the Israelites were enslaved and forced into hard labor. Yet even in the midst of their suffering, Joseph's bones remained a silent reminder of God's promises. His faith in the future deliverance of his people was a beacon of hope, a light in the darkness. Joseph's story didn't end with his death. It was woven into the fabric of Israel's history, pointing forward to the day when God would fulfill his covenant and bring his people home. What happened to Joseph's bones? How did his faith shape the destiny of his people? And what does his story teach us about trusting in God's promises, even when we can't see the outcome? The answers lie in the events that unfolded centuries later, events that would reveal the profound impact of Joseph's faith and the faithfulness of God. Stay with me, because the story is about to take a dramatic turn, one that will leave you in awe of how God's promises are always fulfilled, no matter how long it takes. Joseph's death was not an ordinary passing. In Egypt, a land known for its elaborate burial practices and deep reverence for the afterlife, Joseph was given the honor of an Egyptian embalming. This process, reserved for the elite and powerful, involved carefully preserving the body to ensure its integrity for the journey to the afterlife. For Joseph, a Hebrew who had risen to become the second most powerful man in Egypt, this was a fitting tribute to his status and influence. But Joseph's embalming was more than just an honor. It was a paradox. While the Egyptians embalmed their dead to prepare them for an eternal existence in their own land, Joseph's embalming served a different purpose. His body, placed in a sarcophagus, was not meant to remain in Egypt forever. Instead, it was a temporary resting place, a holding ground until the day when God would fulfill his promise and bring the Israelites out of Egypt. This detail is profoundly significant. Joseph's sarcophagus was not just a tomb, it was a symbol of hope. It represented the tension between the present reality and the future promise. The Israelites were thriving in Egypt, but they were not home. Joseph's preserved body, waiting in its Egyptian sarcophagus, was a constant reminder that their time in Egypt was temporary. It pointed to a future deliverance, a day when God would act on behalf of his people and lead them to the land he had promised. Joseph's embalming also highlights the cultural intersection of his story. As a Hebrew in Egypt, Joseph had navigated two worlds, the world of his family's faith and the world of Egyptian power and tradition. His embalming was a reflection of his unique position, a blending of cultures that underscored his dual identity. Yet even in death, Joseph's true allegiance was clear. He was not an Egyptian at heart. He was a son of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. His final request, that his bones be carried out of Egypt, was a declaration of his faith in the God of his fathers and the promises he had made. The sarcophagus that held Joseph's body was a silent witness to the faithfulness of God. For centuries, it stood as a reminder that the Israelites' story was not over. Joseph's bones, preserved and waiting, were a tangible link to the promises of God, a promise that one day his people would be free. But how long would they have to wait? And what would it take for God's promise to be fulfilled? The answers lie in the events that unfolded generations later, events that would test the faith of the Israelites and reveal the power of God in ways no one could have imagined. Joseph's story didn't end with his death. It was a prologue to one of the most dramatic moments in biblical history. What happened to Joseph's bones, and how did his faith shape the destiny of his people? The story is about to take a dramatic turn, and the answers will leave you in awe of God's perfect timing and faithfulness. After Joseph's death, the Israelites continued to live in Egypt, thriving in the land of Goshen. For a time, they enjoyed the favor and protection that Joseph's legacy had secured for them. They grew in number, becoming a numerous and mighty people, just as God had promised to Abraham. But as the years turned into decades and the decades into centuries, the political landscape of Egypt began to shift. A new pharaoh rose to power, one who did not know Joseph or the incredible contributions he had made to Egypt. This pharaoh saw the Israelites not as allies, but as a threat. Their growing numbers and strength made him uneasy, and he feared that they might side with Egypt's enemies in a time of war. Driven by paranoia and a desire to maintain control, Pharaoh devised a plan to oppress the Israelites. He subjected them to forced labor, tasking them with building store cities, monuments, and infrastructure for the Egyptian empire. The Israelites' lives became marked by hardship and suffering. They were treated as slaves, their bodies and spirits broken, under the weight of relentless labor. Yet, even in the midst of their oppression, the Israelites continued to multiply, a testament to God's blessing and faithfulness. Pharaoh, desperate to curb their growth, resorted to even more extreme measures, ordering the killing of newborn Hebrew boys. It was a dark and desperate time, a stark contrast to the prosperity and favor the Israelites had once enjoyed under Joseph's influence. But why did God allow this to happen? Why were his people subjected to such suffering after Joseph had worked so hard to secure their place in Egypt? The answer lies in the bigger picture of God's plan. The oppression of the Israelites was not a sign of God's abandonment. It was a necessary part of the journey toward fulfillment of his promises. Centuries earlier, God had told Abraham that his descendants would be strangers in a land not their own, where they would be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. But he also promised to deliver them and bring them back to the land he had promised. The suffering of the Israelites in Egypt was a fulfillment of this prophecy. It was a painful but necessary chapter in the story of God's people, a chapter that would set the stage for one of the most dramatic acts of deliverance in history. And through it all, Joseph's bones remained in Egypt, a silent but powerful reminder of God's promises. Joseph's faith had foreseen this moment. His final words, his insistence that his bones be carried out of Egypt, were a declaration that the Israelites' time in Egypt was temporary. His preserved body was a symbol of hope, a reminder that God's promises would not fail, no matter how long it took. But how would God deliver his people? And what role would Joseph's bones play in the fulfillment of his promises? The answers lie in the events that unfolded centuries later, events that would reveal the power and faithfulness of God in ways no one could have imagined. The story of Joseph and his bones was far from over. It was about to take a dramatic and miraculous turn. Centuries after Joseph's death, the cries of the Israelites reached a tipping point. Their suffering under Egyptian oppression had become unbearable, and they cried out to God for deliverance. It was in this moment of desperation that God raised up a deliverer, Moses. Through a series of miraculous events, Moses was called by God to confront Pharaoh and demand the release of his people. What followed was a dramatic showdown between the power of Egypt and the power of the Almighty. The 10 plagues, each more devastating than the last, demonstrated God's supremacy over the gods of Egypt and his determination to free his people. Finally, after the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh relented. The Israelites were free to leave Egypt. But their departure was not a quiet escape. It was a triumphant exodus, marked by the plundering of Egyptian wealth and the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham that his descendants would leave their place of bondage with great possessions. Amid the chaos and celebration of the Exodus, one detail stands out. The Israelites did not forget Joseph's final request. Before leaving Egypt, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, just as Joseph had made his family swear to do centuries earlier. This act was more than a fulfillment of a promise. It was a powerful symbol of faith. Joseph's bones carried out of Egypt represented the fulfillment of God's promise to bring his people back to the land he had sworn to give them. The journey to the promised land was not easy. The Israelites faced trials, rebellions, and moments of doubt. Yet through it all, Joseph's bones served as a tangible reminder of God's faithfulness. They were a link between the past and the future, a testament to the fact that God's promises are never forgotten, no matter how long it takes for them to be fulfilled. When the Israelites finally entered the land of Canaan under Joshua's leadership, Joseph's bones were laid to rest in Shechem, in the plot of land Jacob had purchased centuries earlier. This act of burial was the final fulfillment of Joseph's prophetic request. His bones, which had waited in Egypt for so long, were now at rest in the land of promise, a symbol of God's faithfulness to his covenant. Joseph's story, which began with dreams and betrayal, ended with the fulfillment of a promise that spanned generations. His life was a testament to the sovereignty of God, showing how even the darkest moments can be used to accomplish his purposes. His death and the journey of his bones were a powerful reminder that God's promises are sure, even when they take time to unfold. But Joseph's legacy doesn't end there. His story points forward to an even greater deliverance, the redemption brought by Jesus Christ. Just as Joseph's bones were carried out of Egypt as a symbol of hope, Jesus' resurrection is the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise to deliver his people from bondage. Joseph's faith in God's promises echoes through the ages, reminding us that no matter how long we wait, God is always faithful to his word. What can we learn from Joseph's story? How does his faith inspire us to trust in God's promises, even when the journey is long and difficult? The answers lie in the enduring legacy of Joseph, a man who held on to hope until the very end and saw the faithfulness of God in ways he could never have imagined. Joseph's death was not the end of his story, it was the beginning of a legacy that would inspire generations. His final act of faith, his request to have his bones carried out of Egypt, was a declaration that he believed in a future he would not live to see. This act of hope was not just for himself, but for his people, a reminder that God's promises are unwavering, even when they take time to unfold. Joseph's life had been marked by extraordinary highs and devastating lows. From the pit to the palace, from betrayal to reconciliation, he had experienced the full spectrum of human emotion and divine intervention. Yet, through it all, Joseph remained steadfast in his faith. He understood that his life was part of a bigger story, a story that stretched back to the promises God had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Joseph's death, then, was not a tragic end, but a beacon of hope. His bones, preserved in Egypt for centuries, were a silent witness to the faithfulness of God. They reminded the Israelites that their time in Egypt was temporary, that their true home was in the land God had promised. Even in the darkest moments of their oppression, Joseph's bones were a symbol of hope, a promise that deliverance was coming. When the Exodus finally happened, and Moses carried Joseph's bones out of Egypt, it was a powerful moment of fulfillment. Joseph's faith had not been in vain. His trust in God's promises had carried him through the trials of his life, and now, centuries later, his faith was being rewarded. His bones, once a symbol of waiting, became a symbol of victory, a testament to the fact that God always keeps his word. But Joseph's legacy doesn't end with the Exodus. His story points forward to an even greater deliverance, the redemption brought by Jesus Christ. Just as Joseph's bones were carried out of Egypt as a symbol of hope, Jesus' resurrection is the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise to deliver his people from bondage. Joseph's faith in God's promises echoes through the ages, reminding us that no matter how long we wait, God is always faithful to his word. Joseph's death, then, is not just a historical event, it's a lesson in faith and hope. It teaches us that even in the face of uncertainty and suffering, we can trust in God's promises. It reminds us that our lives are part of a bigger story, a story that God is writing with perfect timing and purpose. What can we learn from Joseph's story? How does his faith inspire us to hold on to hope, even when the journey is long and difficult? The answers lie in the enduring legacy of Joseph, a man who believed in the promises of God until the very end and saw their fulfillment in ways he could never have imagined. His story is a reminder that no matter how dark the night, the dawn is coming, and with it, the fulfillment of every promise God has made. Joseph's story is one of the most powerful narratives in the Bible, a testament to the faithfulness of God and the enduring power of hope. From his early days as a dreamer to his final moments as a prophet, Joseph's life was marked by unwavering faith in God's promises. His death, far from being an end, was a bridge to the future, a reminder that God's plans are always greater than we can imagine. Joseph's bones, carried out of Egypt during the Exodus, were more than just a fulfillment of his final request. They were a symbol of God's faithfulness. They reminded the Israelites that their suffering was temporary and that God's promises would never fail. Joseph's legacy teaches us that even in the darkest moments we can hold on to hope, knowing that God is working behind the scenes to fulfill his purposes. But Joseph's story isn't just a historical account. It's a call to action for us today. It challenges us to live with the same faith and hope that Joseph demonstrated, to trust in God's promises even when the journey is long and difficult. It reminds us that our lives are part of a bigger story, a story that God is writing with perfect timing and purpose. So what can we take away from Joseph's life and legacy? First, we learn that faith is not just about believing in God's promises. It's about living in light of those promises, even when we can't see the outcome. Second, we see that God can use even the most difficult circumstances to accomplish his purposes. And finally, we are reminded that our hope is not in this world, but in the promises of God, which are sure and unchanging. If Joseph's story has inspired you, if it has reminded you of the power of faith and the faithfulness of God, then let's take this journey together. Hit the like button if this message resonated with you, and subscribe to the channel if you want to dive deeper into stories like this that can transform your life. Let's grow in faith and understanding, one story at a time, because just like Joseph, we are part of a bigger story, a story of hope, redemption, and the unshakable promises of God. Don't miss out on what's coming next. See you in the next video.